Welcome to the Michael Lofton Show here on Reason and Theology on a Monday, where I'm going to review the discussion between Glenn Beck, a Mormon, and Taylor Marshall. And they discuss Pope Francis and end times prophecy and Catholic perspectives on Pope Francis and all sorts of things. It's about an hour and 15 minutes. Obviously, I'm not going to play the whole video. I'm just going to go over some select highlights. But for those who may not be familiar, maybe if you're tuning in for the first time and you're not familiar with me or my work, I'll say at the outset. So I am a Catholic who is faithful to the Catholic magisterium. So I am a traditional Catholic. I hold to what the Catholic Church teaches. I assent to the magisterium. That is the teaching authority of the church and its teachings. Right. I also am conservative in my perspective politically. Now, there have been people who have accused me of being what's called a popesplainer, a person who just makes whatever excuse that one can make for Pope Francis to just explain away some difficulty or problem. I want to just clear up at the outset that I'm not a popesplainer. I do have many criticisms of Pope Francis that I have offered here on this show. I will not defend error. I will not defend problems where there are real problems. I will say this, though. There are a lot of people who are accusing all kinds of people of all sorts of things, and often they're inaccurate in nature. And I think that if we are going to accuse Pope Francis of something, we need to be accurate in our information. And what I'll often do is point out that people are inaccurate in their information. They are lacking accuracy in many cases, and I'll point that out. So ultimately, I am not an apologist for Pope Francis. I am an apologist for Jesus Christ and his church. I'm an apologist for the truth, wherever the truth is. And I believe the fullness of the faith and the fullness of the truth is in the Catholic Church. So that is what I do here. And so I want to take a look at this discussion between Taylor Marshall and Glenn Beck. I found it fascinating, and one of the reasons is this. I used to hold to the perspective of Taylor Marshall before Taylor Marshall ever held to the perspective that he currently holds to. Before Taylor Marshall was criticizing the Pope and saying all the things that he's saying and promoting all the prophecies that he's promoting, pretty much promoting all of the content you're going to see here in this discussion with Glenn Beck. Before Taylor Marshall was doing any of that, I was doing so, and I was also doing it publicly as an author for newspapers and online journals. And I was what you would call a radical traditionalist, which is what they're going to be discussing here in a moment. Now, I would not have called myself a radical traditionalist. I just saw myself as a faithful Catholic. But it was of a very perspective that was incredibly radical, and not radical in a good way, because there is a good radical, right? A lot of the things that Jesus says was pretty radical. But no, what we're talking about here when we refer to radical traditionalists, we're referring to a movement of people who say that they're faithful to the Catholic magisterium, say that they're traditional Catholics, but in fact they're anything but. And they put their own opinions and interpretations of the faith over and against what the Catholic Church actually teaches. So in fact, they're not traditional. In many ways, they're Protestant in the way that they think. Because ultimately at the heart of Protestantism is the error that I put myself in the driver's seat. I'm the ultimate arbiter of what is true. If this lines up with my opinion, I'm going to go with it. But if the church says something that violates my opinion, I'm not going to assent to what the church says. I'm going to push back against it. If Pope Francis teaches this and I don't like it, you know what? I'm going to push back against it because it doesn't agree with me. And of course, it's not me that I'm saying everybody has to agree with. It's ultimately really my interpretation of Scripture. So what a radical traditionalist would say is they would say, well, I'm not saying everybody has to agree with me. I'm just saying they have to agree with the Bible, and they have to agree with what the magisterium has taught in the past and the faith of the Catholic Church. But what they're doing is they're putting their interpretation of those things in the forefront over and against the magisterium and the Catholic Church's interpretation of those things. So that's what a radical traditionalist is in a nutshell. And that's what I was. And I realized the error of that. I saw where it led me, and it led me outside of the Catholic Church. Now, I came back to Catholic communion and I had to retrace my steps and ask what really led me to leaving the Catholic Church? What led me to that position? And I saw that it was me buying into this notion that I get to judge the magisterium. I get to judge the teachings of the Pope. I get to judge these decisions of an ecumenical council. And I realized, well, when that happens, ultimately, there's nothing really to tether me to the Catholic Church. I'm going to become unhinged and leave and go to wherever there's a group out there that agrees with my interpretation of these things. So I went to Eastern Orthodoxy. But again, when I came back, I realized, wow, okay, so this is kind of what led me there. And I'm seeing a lot of people making those same mistakes. And you're going to see that from Taylor Marshall here in a moment. What Taylor Marshall does, if you're not familiar, is he sets himself in opposition to Pope Francis and his teachings, not just Pope Francis and his private interpretations and private opinions. You can disagree with Pope Francis as a private individual. But as a Catholic, you're to assent to his teachings. Well, what Taylor Marshall does is he rejects those. He also rejects some of the teachings of the most recent ecumenical council, the Second Vatican Council. In fact, he accuses Vatican II of teaching heresy. He also accuses Pope Francis of teaching heresy. In fact, in a video that I've shown recently, he even anathematized Pope Francis twice, not just once, but twice. So what he does is he sets himself in opposition to the magisterium of the Catholic Church. He won't put it in those terms, but that's exactly what it is. Just like a pro-abortionist won't put it in terms of saying, well, yeah, I kill babies, or I'm in favor of killing babies. They're not going to put it in those terms, but that's what it is. You're in favor of killing babies. That's what it is, whether you call it that or not. And that's what's going on here. So with that perspective, let's now take a look at Taylor Marshall and his interview with Glenn Beck. Let's maybe start around the 1 minute 40, actually right around the 2 minute mark. They're going to begin to discuss terms like radical traditionalists and such. Okay, so let me make sure I got the volume all the way up. I'm going to share my screen, and let's go ahead and begin right around the 2 minute mark.
So good to have you here. Thank you so much. I want to start with the understanding that I grew up Catholic, so I know a little bit of what we're going to talk about, but the audience may not understand some of these terms or anything else. So as we go, let's make sure that we define everything so people understand what is Catholic doctrine, tradition, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to talk to you because you're known as a rad trad.
A radical traditionalists.
Right?
Yeah.
What is that?
Rad trad. So it kind of goes back to the 1960s. A lot of people know this, but in the 1960s, the Catholic Church was facing the modern world, and they said, maybe we should update ourselves.
Because it was still priest facing the altar,
speaking Latin.
Right.
Yes. Everything was still very medieval, Gregorian chant.
Right.
And so the leadership, the cardinals, the pope said, maybe we should kind of update things.
And much can be said here as far as updating and modernizing things and how the liturgy was in the preconciliar era. And we can certainly lament all of the, banal and even atrocious in some instances liturgies that some may find in the Roman Rite in the way that they're practiced. I think we can all agree that there's some legitimate criticism owed there. But I do want to point out, I do have quite a few videos about the liturgy that will paint a little bit of a different picture and help you understand that the Roman Rite has developed significantly over the last 2,000 years. And what we do see with the Second Vatican Council and the post-conciliar reforms to the liturgy are fairly significant, but we have also seen some significant developments previously to the Roman liturgy. And so there is really a criticism, if we're going to make a criticism of the development to the liturgy in the post-conciliar era, there's a whole lot of criticisms that could be made to even what he's describing here as the medieval period in the medieval liturgy, or what's called the traditional Latin Mass, which is a misnomer. So I just want to be consistent and say, but we could also apply those same criticisms to the very liturgy that I believe that Taylor Marshall is very fond of in particular too. But I digress. Let's continue.
Modernize things. And so a council was called in the early 1960s called the Second Vatican Council. And they said, maybe we should be more ecumenical, have more dialogue, put the Mass and the
kind of like Taylor Marshall and what he's doing right now with Glenn Beck, which I'm just going to point out at the outset. He never really challenges Glenn Beck on his leaving Catholicism or being a Mormon. He doesn't really challenge him and offer a whole lot of pushback on that. What he does is he has a cordial discussion with him and tries to find mutual things that they have in common, so that they can see, okay, well, here's what we can agree on, and here's how we could maybe work together on these things. Well, guess what? That's called ecumenism. But Taylor Marshall often speaks of ecumenism in a very negative way, and yet here we're literally seeing Taylor Marshall living out ecumenism.
Sacraments in the vernacular, have modern music, and this kind of set a trajectory on for the Catholic Church of being more and more comfortable with the world. And so since the 1960s, particularly the 1970s, there's been a growing movement of people who identify themselves as traditionalist.
I'll say this, us having conversations with the world is not bad in and of itself. That's certainly something that we are to do. According to the apostolic tradition, St. Paul certainly did that. But there is a potential danger here whenever we have these discussions with people in the world, and that is becoming conformed to the image and likeness of the world rather than the image and likeness of Christ, which is something that we're struggling with. Sometimes in these discussions, we give too much and we're looking too much at the world rather than showing that we're a peculiar people, as the New Testament puts it. So there is a legitimate criticism that we can make here about how some of these discussions that we have with the world, though they are legitimate in and of themselves, and they're in fact apostolic and were commissioned to have them by Jesus, they do have some pitfalls, they do have some dangers, and sometimes I do see some tendencies where rather than witnessing to the world is witnessing to us. Rather than us calling the world to be conformed to Christ, we are being conformed more to the world. There is a legitimate criticism there. So I don't want to just push back against this whole thing as if there's just no legitimate concerns here. There are.
And they say, maybe that was a mistake. Maybe us becoming comfortable with the world and updating and modernize has now led us to compromise on things that have to do with same-sex unions or women's ordination or dogmatic commitments of the Catholic.
Well, yeah, there's a lot of people who have these concerns about, blessing same-sex unions. I mean, I totally understand anybody who would be concerned about that. That's certainly not something that the church can allow for. But to maybe put some of those concerns to rest, Pope Francis himself in his magisterium in 2021 has said the church cannot bless sin. And he's specifically talking about blessing same-sex unions. That is part of the magisterium, and that is not going to change. Pope Francis is also the one who says homosexuality is a sin. So, of course, Pope Francis is not going to approve of those things. But I understand that there are some people who are pushing for that. And yeah, we need to push back against them. And we need to say that's not okay. And in fact, I've done quite a few videos where I've pushed back against the German bishops who have been playing footsie with the world and have been doing this very thing. They have been promoting something that is worldly rather than of Christ and his order and his church. And in fact, they're pushing back against the magisterium and dissenting from it rather than assenting to it. So again, there's some legitimate concerns that we can offer here, but I do want to put people put people's concerns to rest here and assure them the Catholic Church is not going to change the faith. The magisterium is not going to change the faith. And again, any entertainment of the notion that Pope Francis is somehow going to cave into these things is absurd, because again, it's the same Pope Francis who has said the church cannot bless sin. This is a sin. This is also the same Pope Francis who has put into canon law an automatic excommunication for anybody who attempts to ordain a woman. So obviously that is not going to happen. Pope Francis is not going to allow for women's ordination. In fact, I did a video responding to Father Thomas Reese last night, calling him out for suggesting that the Synod and Pope Francis is going to change that. And it's absolutely a false claim. All right, let's continue.
Church. So that group of people are known sort of as traditionalists as opposed to modernists. Or Novus Ordo, New Order.
Oh boy. All right. We have a massive problem here. Two problems. Number one, he's not properly defining the heresy of modernism. And then number two, he just equated that with the Novus Ordo. Massive problem for two reasons. Okay, first, let's address the question of what is modernism. So if you look through Pascendi and Lamentabili and the Oath Against Modernism and some of the acts and works of Pope Pius X, who was very outspoken against modernism at the turn of the 20th century, if you look at that, you'll see what modernism is. And effectively what modernism does is it says, I accept the dogmas of the church, but then the modernist redefines what those dogmas mean. So they'll say, I accept the resurrection, but what you and I mean by the resurrection is the bodily resurrection of Jesus, right? But they would redefine it to mean something very different that is not an affirmation of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So they'll say, I affirm the resurrection, but it's something else. So they redefine what these dogmas mean, which was condemned at the First Vatican Council and obviously also condemned under Pius X's teachings against modernism, which obviously still stand. So he just completely misdefined what modernism is and then attached it to the Novus Ordo. Look, for better or worse, I'll be very frank. The vast majority of heretics out there today and the vast majority of dissenters out there aren't actually meeting the definition of your classical modernists. They're not modernists per se. I call them neo-modernists. They're kind of a new version because they'll say, oh yeah, I accept the dogmas of the church. And then they'll mean what you mean by the dogmas of the church. But what they'll do is they'll just completely ignore those dogmas in their disciplines and completely ignore those dogmas practically. And they'll undermine them in other ways. So they're a little different than the original modernists who would just completely redefine what the dogma is. They'll define it properly. They'll just work against it or ignore it or pretend it doesn't exist. They're neo-modernists. So he's conflating these two things. And then again, he's attaching that to the Novus Ordo, which is the Reformed liturgy. Now, we all agree the Reformed liturgy has been, in many cases, celebrated very poorly and badly, and sometimes has some significant abuses. And we can all agree to critique that. I'm right there with you. I stand firm with you in critiquing those things. I hate bad Novus Ordo liturgies. They really disgust me. And I've actually paid, and I mean really have had to deal with real issues, real problems, because I've spoken out against those abuses even to bishops. And again, I have had to endure some injustices because of that. So I'm right there with you in defending the liturgy, the holiness of the liturgy. But what happens is sometimes in overreacting against those abuses, we begin to critique the Novus Ordo itself as if the Novus Ordo itself is the problem, and it's not. It's not so much the Novus Ordo itself that is the problem as much as it is some of the celebrants of the Novus Ordo. And if you were to take those same celebrants who are problematic and have them celebrate the Byzantine liturgy or have them celebrate the Missal of 62, the what's again erroneously called the traditional Latin Mass, they would abuse those things too. Believe me, in the preconciliar period, there are plenty of liturgical abuses of the quote unquote Latin Mass. Because, when you have somebody who doesn't really have a strong faith, you have a priest who's not really strong in their faith, they're going to abuse the liturgy no matter what that liturgy is. Now, we might say, well, this particular liturgy doesn't lend itself to abuses as much as this liturgy. Perhaps. But again, abuse does not negate proper use. A person who is properly disposed, who does want to celebrate the liturgy properly, according to the text, according to the rubrics, in the right spirit, is not going to be engaging in bad liturgical abuses. So the problem is more with the celebrant than it actually is the Novus Ordo itself. But what we did is we just completely slandered an actual liturgy promulgated by multiple popes and the College of Bishops. Because it's not just the popes who have promulgated this missal. It's the vast majority of the bishops, therefore the College of Bishops. So the magisterium has promulgated this liturgy, and we just completely slandered it by calling it modernist. And that's uncalled for. That's inappropriate. That's anything but traditional. That is not traditional. That is why I say people who call themselves traditional Catholics in many instances actually aren't traditional Catholics. They're Protestants in disguise. They're not traditional. It is not traditional to speak of a Catholic liturgy this way. Let's continue.
It's actually a name that they use. Kind of reminds you of the Novus Ordo Secularum,
Yeah.
right? And so I guess people who are critical of the more traditional voice would use the term rad trad, somewhat pejorative.
Okay.
I would just say I'm a Catholic who is very much in line with the traditional worship and doctrine of the church.
Yeah, I'm also a Catholic who's very much in line with the traditional worship, and yet Taylor Marshall and I are radically different. Why is that? Well, because just simply saying I'm a traditional Catholic isn't really getting at the heart of, well, what does that mean? You have to now define those terms, and he doesn't really accurately define them. I claim to be a traditional Catholic. He claims to be a traditional Catholic. Yet I'm not anathematizing Pope Francis, and I'm also not accusing an ecumenical council of teaching heresy, as he has done, which he did in multiple videos, which I've reviewed. I've also not accused Pope Francis of teaching heresy in his magisterium, which he has done multiple times. So there's a pretty big problem here. We can't both be traditional Catholics when we're this different. One of us is anathematizing the Pope, kind of like your Martin Luther, who anathematized popes and wants to say this Pope is teaching heresy and this council is teaching heresy. Well, Martin Luther was doing all that too. And Martin Luther thought that he was a faithful Catholic as well. So at the end of the day, you have to really define these terms. What does it mean to be a traditional Catholic? Is it traditional to anathematize the Pope? Is it traditional to accuse Pope Francis of teaching heresy in his magisterium? Is it traditional to accuse an entire ecumenical council of teaching heresy? The heresy of Pelagianism, which he accuses it of? No, that's not traditional. So I'm not buying the way he defines these terms, because obviously they're anything but traditional. Let's continue.
Traditionalist, is it capital T or lowercase t?
That's a good question. I guess it's capital.
Okay. What does that mean to you?
It just means that, fundamentally, and I'm very vocal about this, I have a podcast and YouTube channel, that I believe that the decisions that were made in the 1960s, all the way up until really 2023 with Pope Francis, that was a pivot that ultimately has undermined Christian teaching.
Okay. A lot going on here with the Second Vatican Council. Let me say this. Having studied Vatican II very thoroughly, and also having studied the preconciliar era all the way back to patristic times very thoroughly, and having studied the magisterium very, very carefully, that's what my expertise is in, I can tell you very confidently that what Vatican II is doing is not what we're criticizing. What Vatican II is doing is good and healthy. I'll tell you this. If you look at the opening speech of John the 23rd, what is his main commission for the Second Vatican Council? What's the number one thing? What's the number one thing he told Vatican II to do? If you can't answer that question, I'm going to tell you right now, you're not in a position to evaluate Vatican II in the post-conciliar tradition and post-conciliar era. If you can't answer my question right now, you don't know enough about this subject matter to comment on this. So it would be good to just revert back to learning mode rather than pontificating mode on social media. The number one task that he assigned to the Second Vatican Council was to guard the deposit of faith. His words, guard the deposit of faith. What does that mean? To guard what has been revealed to us by God through his son, Jesus Christ. Guard the deposit of faith. And then what was the second thing, the second task that he gave to Vatican II? Number 2 was, after guarding the deposit of faith, then communicate that in an effective way to the modern world. Now, that is straight up St. Paul. That is straight up the apostles. They're guarding the deposit of faith. They're handing it down to successors. But they're guarding the deposit of faith and they're communicating it to the modern world. Look at Acts 17. Paul goes before the pagans there and preaches before them Christ, Jesus, which was folly to them. It was foolishness to them that Jesus was resurrected. They didn't believe any of that. Well, he communicated, however, in a way that was effective to them because he took their idol that they had there, an idol that was dedicated to an unknown God. And he says, you see that idol that you have over there to an unknown God? That's the God I proclaim to you. He took the gospel and communicated it to them in an effective way that they could understand. That is what Vatican II did. However, there have been many abuses of that task. So Vatican II was commissioned to do this, guard the deposit of faith, communicate it to the modern world. It did that in its documents. The problem is when we have gone to carry that out, when we have gone to present Vatican II, we've done a horrible job. We've done a terrible job, especially as Catholics. We misrepresent Vatican II constantly. You know why? Well, most of us haven't even read the documents of Vatican II. We haven't even read the 16 documents, let alone do we properly understand them in their historical context and what they're getting at. So that's the issue here. So the problem isn't so much Vatican II as much as it is ignorant Catholics who are not actually carrying out what the documents say, but are abusing them and actually going against what the documents say. That is the problem. Okay, so let's see what he says here about Pope Francis. He's going to offer some interesting comments about him and Bill Clinton here in just a second.
Instead of the emphasis on discipleship, fasting, prayer, focus on Jesus Christ.
All of the things that Vatican II promoted, so if we get back to promoting that, we'll promote all those things that Taylor Marshall just said.
It's a lot more globalist, a lot more focused on the UN. Just today, Bill Clinton announced that he's going to have this conversation with Pope Francis about globalism. And I think that trajectory in the 1960s got us to the Pope sitting down with Bill Clinton.
See, this is exactly the same problem that the Pharisees had with Jesus, and we're repeating the same error of the Pharisees. This is why we need to know the faith better. Pope Francis talking to Bill Clinton reminds me of Jesus talking to sinners. Paul talking to sinners. I want my Pope to be effective in the world and to be able to communicate with it. I want him to have a voice in the world. I want him to be able to sit down and talk to Bill Clinton about the faith and balance out his errors. I want him to be able to do that in the same way that Jesus did that, in the same way that Paul did that, and others. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is, if the Pope were to just sit down and talk to Bill Clinton and never challenge him on his errors, that is a problem. Now, that hasn't happened with Pope Francis, but if Pope Francis were to do that, that is a problem. But guess what we just stepped into? We just stepped into irony. You know why? Because Taylor Marshall is having a discussion with a Mormon, and he never really corrects him on his massive errors of Mormonism. He doesn't really do that. He sidesteps most of the differences. And he tries to work towards a common ground instead of really challenging Glenn Beck. So the very thing that we would accuse Pope Francis of doing with meeting with Bill Clinton is actually what we're seeing taking place between Taylor Marshall and Glenn Beck. So upon what basis, if you don't properly do these things yourself, if you don't witness to people properly yourself, upon what basis can you then criticize Pope Francis for allegedly doing this with Bill Clinton, which that hasn't even been substantiated? Is there any evidence that he meets with Bill Clinton and doesn't challenge him? Is there any evidence for that? Of course there isn't. But if there was, then we would have to criticize him, but we would also have to do the exact same thing for Taylor Marshall, because Taylor Marshall is doing that very same thing. This is the problem with the Pharisees. They're what's called hypocrites. The Pharisees, which we're seeing being repeated in the Catholic Church today with many of the radical traditionalists, they're the new Pharisees of today. They strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. They will crucify Pope Francis for this, and yet they go and do it themselves 5 times over. Rather than looking inward and saying, hey, am I guilty of this same thing? They just point and accuse and say, look at how bad he is. Look at how bad this is. But they're not asking, wait, am I guilty of that same thing? And am I falsely accusing somebody?
I think that's a problem. Okay. I'm not happy about that. And actually, I mean, it's growing globally, this sort of traditional mindset of like, we're starting to see the fruit that's been born in the 2020s, particularly when COVID happened. And people are scratching their head and say, well, how did my grandmother's Catholicism was radically different than what's going on now.
Yeah, see, this is where Taylor Marshall sets himself up for failure. And any knowledgeable Eastern Orthodox would rake him across the coals with this. And they would just say, look, okay, you're talking about discontinuity between you and your grandmother's Catholicism. Yeah, that's kind of our argument against you Catholics for the first millennium and second millennium. And they would point to some pretty radical changes in the Roman liturgy and in the Roman rite itself as a whole, in the Latin Church as a whole. And they'll say, this is very different than what we were previously, or you guys were previously doing. This is radically different. And so they would point to these things and say, wait, you're not going back far enough. You're pointing to discontinuity between you and your grandmother's Catholicism. But why is your grandmother's Catholicism the standard? Because your grandmother's Catholicism is a massive departure from first millennium Catholicism. And they'll just point out those inconsistencies and just say, go further, Taylor. Be more consistent. Look back further. Don't just look back to the 60s and the 50s. Look back further to the first millennium and see how far you've gone in your Latin Church from those standards and from those canons and from those councils. And they'll point out all the inconsistencies here. And then a guy like me has to step in and defend the Catholic Church against those Eastern Orthodox who are rightly pointing out inconsistencies on part of radical traditionalists like Taylor Marshall. And I have to come in and clean up the mess that they made, because they opened themselves up for really bad criticism from Eastern Orthodox with these really horrible arguments. And so here's where maybe a knowledge of church history and also Eastern Orthodox objections to Catholicism would actually help balance out some of these things. Let's go to the 17-minute mark. I found this part fascinating because this is effectively where Glenn Beck asks Taylor Marshall, hey, are all non-Catholics just damned? Now, I want to point to a parallel here. You remember Bishop Robert Barron had an interview with Ben Shapiro a few years ago? Yeah, you remember that? Well, Ben Shapiro asked Bishop Barron a very similar question and said, hey, look, I'm a Jew. I do this, I do that. Am I damned? And Bishop Barron gave an answer. I think it could have used some help. I think it needs some fine tuning, but I understand what he was trying to get at. And, Bishop Barron gave the answer that he gave. And Taylor Marshall and many others roasted Bishop Barron for that answer that he gave. And they felt he didn't properly challenge Ben Shapiro. Now, Bishop Barron responded to that. I'm not going into that whole controversy. I'm just using it at the moment as an analogy. People criticized him, said he didn't go into Ben Shapiro's problems far enough. He didn't challenge him enough. And those same folks like Taylor Marshall then appear before Glenn Beck, a discussion with a Mormon who is a former Catholic who left the Catholic faith, and they don't challenge them themselves. Epic fail. And so again, the same things that they accuse others of, they end up doing themselves when they're in the hot seat and they have to be put on the spot. If witness to a non-Catholic, can they do it? Can they really call them out for Mormonism? Well, let's see. Let's see what answer he gives. He's going to ask again, are non-Catholics damned? Watch this.
And they all are going, no. Then yes, that's what it is. But it's not dictated because a church is in bed. A church. The church, if you look at the church as a body, sure.
That's what I'm saying. Like, we are the church.
Correct. We are. I'm not Catholic.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know why he said to a Mormon, we are the church. That was a really weird part that wasn't ever really cleared up in this interview. I don't know why he said that. That's weird. And it's odd because even Glenn Beck is like, hold on, wait, I think there's some discontinuity here. We are the church. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that Mormons aren't actually part of the church that Christ established. I'm pretty sure that the institutional church Christ established does not include Mormonism. So I don't know what was going on with that part. Maybe he just misspoke. Maybe he has someone else in mind when he was saying this, but it just doesn't look good. But now whenever he's asked with, faced with the question of, okay, well, non-Catholics, what happens to them? Well, watch the response.
But
You're
the
Catholic.
church is this group of people.
Yes. As long as we're not, we should have defined that.
Yeah.
As long as you're not, if you're defining the church the way Christ defined it as the body of Christ, everybody who is a Christian, right?
Well, I mean, I'm a Catholic, so I had to push back a little bit, right? Because he founded one church, Matthew 16. You are Peter on this church, right? I will build. The gates of hell will not prevail against.
It's you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church, not you are Peter, and on this church.
And there can only be one church. I know this is not ecumenically correct and it's controversial, but there has to be one church. And I think, I used to be a Protestant.
Yeah, there's only one church. Glenn Beck also believes the exact same thing. Where is the challenge? Hey, Glenn, you're not part of that one church. Come back to the Catholic faith. Glenn Beck believes there's only one church. To just simply say, well, I'm a Catholic. I believe Jesus established one church. Everybody believes that. Even Protestants believe there's only one church, true church. They're just going to say, well, that one true church looks different than what you claim it looks like. It's not an institutional thing. They're going to say there's only one true church. Every heretic in the world says there's only one true church. Every heretic out there. Martin Luther, everyone. Nestorius, everyone. They all say there's only one church. They're just defining what that church means differently. But is he going to challenge Glenn Beck? Hey, you're not actually part of that church and you need to come back to the Catholic faith. Nope, it never happens. But he can go and criticize Bishop Barron for the response that he gave to Ben Shapiro for allegedly doing the same thing.
The Protestant minister. One of the frustrating things about being a Christian in our time is all of the division. Mm-hmm. There's currently 45,000 Protestant groups.
No, that's outrageously overblown number. And I think the Protestants are right whenever they point that out. Now, there are a lot of groups among the Protestants, and it's unfortunate, and it's because of their ecclesiology. But oddly enough, Taylor Marshall embraces their same ecclesiology on the point of putting himself in opposition to the magisterium and putting himself in the driver's seat where he gets the judge of the magisterium. That's ultimately the problem with what Martin Luther at the Diet of Worms in his Here I Stand speech I just showed in a previous video yesterday. That is the problem with Martin Luther. He gets to judge the popes. He judges the councils, and he puts his interpretation of the popes and his interpretation of these councils and these popes and this scripture. He puts his interpretation over and against this pope and this council and your interpretation of scripture. He puts himself in the driver's seat and judges the magisterium of Jesus. That is what Luther did. That is what Taylor Marshall did. And so upon what basis can he really criticize all these denominations and Protestantism when at the core, Taylor Marshall holds to that same defective ecclesiology? He just hasn't realized it yet. He just hasn't carried it to its logical conclusion yet. Martin Luther didn't happen overnight. It took him a while for Martin Luther to connect the dots with his whack ecclesiology. It took him a while. And it's also probably going to take Taylor Marshall a while to connect the dots, if he ever connects the dots on some of these things. But if he does, he will see he's ultimately Protestant at the core, not traditional.
Registered with the United States government. 45,000. And I think our Lord Jesus Christ looks down from heaven and says, that's not what I intended for you.
Just a second. You believe God is our loving Father?
Absolutely.
We're his children?
100%.
Are you going to exclude your children because they went to the wrong institution as long as their heart was in the right place? I mean, do you really think that God looks at the Catholics and says, you guys are good, screw the rest of them?
Here it is, sets it up on a T for him. Perfect opportunity to call him back to the Catholic Church. That is Glenn Beck. Does he do it? Watch what he says.
Tons of bad Catholics.
Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
I know that.
Yeah,
I know
tons
that.
of
But
it.
I mean,
yeah.
But God made each of us with individual fingerprints. I can't understand how he could then say, but you have to believe. I mean, believe in Jesus Christ,
right?
Do the things that are the gateway, change your ways, accept the atonement. Got it. But I have to sing these hymns because they're in this church and not in this church. Or I have to accept this done in this way when it really is pretty much the same over here, just different language. I'm not a Christian.
So Jesus instituted.
There it is. So I'm not a Christian. How does he respond? So Jesus instituted a Catholic Church. Watch.
One church. He didn't say, if you guys don't like those hymns, or you don't guys like the color of that carpet, or if you guys disagree on this or that, go and start your own, go register your own nonprofit and create a new church and a new church and a new church. He says that they will know you by your love for one another.
Glenn Beck believes all of that. Glenn Beck believes you don't get to start a church over the color of the carpet. Glenn Beck believes there's only one church. Glenn Beck believes everything Taylor Marshall just said. He just understands it differently. So the answer that Taylor Marshall gave is classic ecumenism. Let's focus on the things that we allegedly agree about, right? And let's not really talk about our differences. And I'm not really going to call you out. Now, that's not actually what ecumenism properly defined is, but that's classic ecumenism insofar as it's critiqued, insofar as people speak poorly of it, insofar as the average person understands it. If you actually look at ecumenism per Vatican II, properly speaking, ecumenism is defined as calling people back to the one Catholic Church. That's actually what ecumenism is. But since it has been misunderstood, it's usually understood as completely evading the issues, avoiding the differences, not calling people out, and just focusing on the things we agree with, even if it requires equivocation. Well, that's exactly what we just saw with Taylor Marshall. Doesn't call him back, doesn't say, hey, no, actually, no, you're not a Christian. This isn't Christianity. And no, your church is not part of this one true church that you believe in. And this isn't what Christ established. We both agree Christ established one church, but you're not part of that. And you need to come back to the Catholic Church because your soul is in danger. Does he ever do that? Nope. No, he just tells Glenn Beck things that he already believes.
Right. He talks about the unity. And the church was united for a very long time. And we've gotten to this idea of every time I disagree with someone, I'm going to start a new sect, a new church.
So
and we have to say,
so hang on.
one church.
Right. But that, I believe the Lord was speaking about the people who followed him.
Yeah. You see, Glenn Beck believes one church. He's just going to define it differently.
Okay. The church.
Yes.
People think of a church as an institution and four walls. It's not. It's the whole world and the people that are following in his way. I mean, I can't imagine you're saying Martin Luther shouldn't have nailed those things to the door, his demands. I mean, Martin Luther, there's some bad stuff about Martin Luther. Yeah. Bad. There's also some bad stuff, from Catholics, and every religion has that. So I'm not singling it out. But, when you're selling indulgences, or Council of Nicaea putting things together and saying, this is the way it is, this is what is going to be in the approved gospel, now kill everybody and destroy everything else. Come on. That's not the way Christ would have done it.
His understanding of church history is atrocious. Wow. Yeah, no, that's not nice. Wow. Somebody's been reading Dan Brown. Golly. That wasn't really addressed, by the way, in the interview. But you'll notice we just completely missed an opportunity to witness to Glenn Beck. Completely missed it. The discussion now moves over to Luther. We're going to now talk about Luther. Missed an opportunity to call somebody who left the Catholic Church back to the Catholic faith. So whenever he wants to, that is Taylor Marshall, whenever he wants to say, well, Pope Francis doesn't say this enough. He doesn't say this enough. Well, you know what? Practice what you preach. Do you do that yourself when you appear with Mormons on their shows? No. So you probably don't have a leg to stand on in criticizing others when you feel that they're not properly telling people about Christ in the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, like, to take the case of Luther, he puts the 95 Thesis on the door at Wittenberg in Latin for an academic scholastic discussion. That's what professors did in the 1500s. I mean, in a way, now they have Substacks and podcasts and stuff, but that was kind of the way things were done. And even like up to 2-3 years after that, he still identifies himself as a Catholic and is engaging in these. The problem happens is, I think it's in 19 or 20, he goes into the public squares, burns the documents, burns the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, and says, here I stand and all that. I don't think that our Lord Jesus Christ wanted us battling it out and anathematizing and condemning one another ad infinitum for centuries.
Oh, he just stepped into it. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that's exactly what Taylor Marshall does with the current magisterium. That's exactly what he does. He says, I don't think that we should be, anathematizing and condemning. Excuse me, that's exactly what you've done to Pope Francis and his magisterium and Vatican II. You've literally accused Vatican II of teaching heresy, Pope Francis of teaching heresy, and in 2 videos, you've anathematized Pope Francis. You've literally said anathema to Pope Francis. Twice, not just once, twice. You've done exactly what Martin Luther did. And so upon what basis is it okay for Taylor Marshall to do this against the current pontificate and against the most recent ecumenical council, but it's not okay for Luther to condemn his current pontificate and his most recent ecumenical council? Luther did the exact same thing. Taylor Marshall is repeating the exact same errors of Martin Luther at their core. And so upon what basis can you say, well, Luther, you can't just condemn the Pope and you can't do these things, and the followers of Luther shouldn't continue to condemn? Wait, why can't they do that? You just did that. And what's going to happen is the followers of Taylor Marshall and others, because he's not the only one in this movement, they're going to be here 50 years from now, 100 years from now. They will be developed. They'll evolve, or rather devolve. But the seeds of what's being planted in this new Protestant rebellion by Taylor Marshall and others, just like the first one, when Martin Luther planted the seeds of rebellion with the Protestant Reformation that led to a whole host of millions of souls rebelling against the Catholic magisterium for 500 years now, this new Protestant rebellion, of which Taylor Marshall is in part an author, that one is also going to be here 50 years from now, 100 years from now, and so on. And so upon what basis does he get to condemn the first movement in the first Protestant rebellion when he's initiating one himself? This is absurd. And it's hypocrisy at its core. And it's hard to see or say, how does he not possibly see that he fits the bill in the very thing he's criticizing? How does he not see that? I guess whenever you're repeating the error of others and repeating these errors in church history, you think your circumstances are different. You think you're different. But rather what we should be doing is learning from church history. What led to the Protestant Reformation? Well, abuses, right? Yes. But then those people who are reacting to the abuses went too far. Yes. Okay, so currently in Catholic history, we have abuses in the Catholic Church. We all agree, and we need to address them. But what's happening is the way some people are addressing them goes too far. They end up anathematizing the Pope, or even saying the Pope isn't the Pope. And they end up condemning his pontificate and magisterium, and condemn the magisterium of an ecumenical council. They end up repeating the same errors of those who went before them, and they go too far.
Like there needs to be a way in which we come to the scripture says one mind in Christ. St. Paul says the renewing of your mind.
Absolutely. You know how you come to one mind? By following the magisterium and not making yourself your own magisterium, as Taylor Marshall does. He makes himself his own magisterium. He sets himself in opposition to the Catholic magisterium and says, no, this Pope said this scripture says that, this council said that, and therefore I'm not going to accept what you're teaching. You make your own magisterium, your own self a magisterium, you're going to have all kinds of splinter groups, just like the Protestants. You're going to find yourself in chaos. If you want to have that one mind, you follow that one teaching authority of the Catholic Church, which is the magisterium. But you can't do that when you're anathematizing it and you're calling it heresy and you're calling it the magisterium heretical. You can't do that. You can't have that one mind. Let's go to the, let's see here. Let's maybe skip to the 42-minute mark where they start to get into some prophecies and a whole frenzy of them, including Garabandal, Fatima, and others. Around the 42-minute mark, however, were some really interesting comments about the most recent consecration of Russia. Now, let me say this. There's so much going on with the Fatima case. I have, 20 or 30 videos already dealing with the third secret, Our Lady of Fatima. There's all kinds of stuff there. I used to hold that the third secret was not fully revealed and that the Fatima prophecy is showing us all kinds of corruption in the Catholic Church and the Vatican Council, Vatican II, and it's showing us this and that, and the Vatican is hiding this part of the secret. I used to say all those things. I used to believe all that until I took a deeper dive in it with the help of scholars who are Fatima scholars. And I realized I missed some really important information here that actually is a game changer. And I'm not going to reproduce all that here. I'll just simply point you to, if you just go to my channel, Reason of Theology, type in Fatima or Third Secret, plenty of videos will come up. So I'm not going to reproduce it all there. There's plenty of stuff there. But I found it fascinating whenever he begins to comment on the consecration of Russia by Pope Francis, because here's what I said. Go and watch my videos on YouTube at the time. Here's what I said. I said, guys like Taylor Marshall and others, they're not going to accept this. You know why? Because they start with a faulty understanding of Fatima, and specifically whether or not the consecration is efficacious. They'll say Well, for the consecration of Russia to be efficacious, it has to actually be converted to the Catholic Church. And they haven't converted to the Catholic Church. Therefore, the consecration has failed. And all the previous consecrations, John Paul II and others, those are improper. Those have failed because Russia hasn't converted to Catholicism. So we've had numerous consecrations of Russia, but in each case they say, oh, there's this defect, there's this problem, there's this problem, there's this problem. And they don't accept it because they start with a faulty premise, and that is to know that it was done properly, it converts to the Catholic faith. Except I've already shown on this channel, Sister Lucy believed what she meant by the consecration of Russia and they'll come back to the faith. What she meant by them coming back to the faith is that they would come back to their Christian roots in the Orthodox Church. That's what she meant. Whether you agree with, the perspective on orthodoxy or not, doesn't matter. That's what the seer meant, as I've demonstrated on the channel. So they start with a faulty premise that it has to come back to the Catholic Church, when in reality, the seer was saying it would return to orthodoxy, its Christian roots in the Orthodox tradition. And they say, well, so it has to be, it has to be a false consecration. And guess what? Lo and behold, Taylor Marshall is about to say, yeah, he doubts the consecration that Pope Francis had. He doubts it because Russia hasn't converted to Catholicism. I called it. There you go.
3 or 5 controversial topics in the Catholic Church is Fatima and the third secret of Fatima.
And he didn't also, you'll know, he didn't do it the way you were supposed to do it, far as he didn't have the bishops worldwide and everything, did he?
He invited them to join in wherever they were. I mean, again, this is a big debate. Did he really?
Right. It's a big debate because people make themselves their own magisterium and they want to say, well, here's how it has to happen. Here's how I think it has to happen. And if you don't do what I think it's invalid. I get to judge the magisterium. I get to judge how the Pope does this. I get to judge this and that. Once again, we've become Protestants. Little mini Martin Luthers.
Meet the criteria of it. I have my doubts about it, honestly. Because the idea is if Russia is consecrated properly, there'll be a massive conversion. And we have seen some positive things in Russia, but we have not seen some not positive things in Russia.
There you go. Called it.
So I don't think it's been done. And related to that, you mentioned Garabandal. Now, Garabandal happened in the 1960s, similar to Fatima. Fatima was approved by the Catholic Church and the Pope. Right. This is a real miracle. We've investigated it. We've interviewed everybody involved. At the end of it, there was this huge miracle of the sun that had 50 to 70,000 people that saw it, including atheists, testified that this miraculous thing happened.
I think it was in the New York Times, too.
It was.
Wasn't it? Yeah.
I mean, all this stuff has been documented, and most of those people are now dead, obviously, but there were interviews with these people that explained what they saw. So something supernatural happened there. Garabandal was a similar situation.
For those who are not familiar with Garabandal, there's a lot of propaganda that's being promoted about it, in favor of it, which Taylor Marshall has also spread false propaganda in favor of it, such as Padre Pio approved of it, among others, which is, again, false. I have done videos on Garabandal. I just recommend that you go and watch that. I'm not going to reproduce it here, but it has not been approved. And there are some serious problems with it. Not to mention, again, some of the alleged evidence that people like Marshall are trying to marshal in favor of Garabandal are actually false. So let's continue, though, because he's going to comment on Garabandal in relation to the Synod on Synodality.
Situation.
Where is it?
That's in Spain.
Okay.
And
so Portugal and
now Spain.
Okay.
And at Garabandal, it was never approved by the church. And there was a few things in it that were controversial. One is that there would be a synod that God would not approve of. Something bad would happen. And
what's a synod?
A synod is like a council, a meeting, a group.
Okay.
That's an inappropriate definition for what we're about to say, because he's about to maybe attach it to the Synod on Synodality, which is certainly not a council, as I've demonstrated per the Code of Canon Law. So if you look at canons, 341 on to the end of the section in the Code of Canon Law, you'll actually see what the Synod on synodality is, and it's not an actual council. So it's effectively a consultative body. So it's not like a teaching council or anything. It's a advisory group that comes together, and it's not even entirely made up of bishops. You have laity who are part of it as well. So already we have a faulty definition for how we're having this discussion, but let's move forward.
That's an official calling for the church. And
Yes.
the Pope calls it, or
Yeah.
who calls it?
Yeah, a pope. Pope. Could be bishops in a certain region, but in
Are
this case.
they regular? A synod?
So it's interesting. Pope Francis has made synods almost a yearly or bi-yearly thing.
All right, so now he's equivocating because he just spoke of local synods, which are very different than the synod of bishops that he's referring to. So local synods would actually be local councils, whereas the synod of bishops is not actually a council at all. So we're now confusing categories here, and we're doing so because the two concepts have the same term in them. That's called equivocation. Just because they have the same word in them doesn't mean they have the same meaning.
And this is what people are interested in. They're like, wow, Francis. And now this year, Francis is having what's called the Synod on Synodality. It's like a double synod on a synod. So people are now, this is why Garabandal has become popular again, because there was this discussion of a bad synod. And now the Pope's having the Synod on Synod, and he's talking about maybe updating teaching on homosexuality or marriage or women in the priesthood.
All right. So listen to this. He's talking about, the issue with blessing of same-sex marriage and women in the priesthood. Well, once again, I'll point out, Pope Francis is the one who says in his own magisterium, the church cannot bless sin. Look it up, 2021. He also has added to canon law, anyone who attempts to ordain a woman is automatically excommunicated. Are you kidding me right now? You're really trying to suggest that the Pope, who has said homosexuality is a sin and you can't bless sin, and the same Pope who puts into canon law, you're automatically excommunicated if you try to ordain a woman, you really want to tell me that Pope is going to try to push for blessing sin and ordaining women? You're not living in reality. You're gaslighting people. You're not actually living in reality. You're living in a bubble filled with propaganda. You're not thinking straight. You're not really living in reality. There's a lot of contrary data that is in conflict with this notion that is not being accounted for here.
It's got a lot of people set off.
Okay, so now this is what Garabandal. Tell me who appeared and who they talked to.
So this is allegedly, and I'm very careful on this. People say, "Are you believing Garabandal?" I'm like, "Well, it's not approved by the church, so I think we should be very guarded and careful about it."
Yeah, that caveat doesn't work. It's not approved by the church. I think we should be guarded, and then he goes on to promote it. Okay.
But again, appeared to 3 children. The lead girl who's most well known is named Conchita, and
she's still alive.
She's still alive, and she lives in New York, and she's quiet.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
But she says that eventually.
Love to talk to her.
I know, right? Get Conchita on the Glenn Beck show. But another element is in that vision. It said that before things get really apocalyptic, like really bad, doesn't say Armageddon, but that kind of idea, the Pope will go to Russia. Now, that's something that Francis has very much been wanting to do, and Putin has been to the Vatican, I think 2 or 3 times already, and Putin is open to it. And allegedly, when the Pope,
I'm sorry, this is not enough to really take this seriously. Are you serious? So, there's a vision out there that says the Pope is going to eat breakfast on Sunday. Okay. Yeah, it's not really, far-fetched to think that the Pope might eat breakfast on Sunday. It's not far-fetched to think that some Pope might actually go to Russia. No matter what period in church history you're looking at, It's not really far-fetched to propose that. That doesn't really do anything for me.
Was going to Mongolia. He was going to stop in the airport and meet with Putin, maybe, and the patriarch of the Orthodox. But these things haven't happened yet. But there is, Pope Francis seems very eager to get to Russia. So the fact that Pope Francis has consecrated Russia and the Ukraine, he's doing this synod of synodality, which has a liberal bent, and then he just seems so eager to get into Russia. You know, Garabandal was kind of a big thing.
You know, he doesn't see the contradiction in what he's saying. He's saying the Pope is consecrating, even though he doesn't believe it's actually valid. He says the Pope is consecrating Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. He's dedicating it to Mary, but he's trying to destroy the faith at the same time. Like, he doesn't see the contradiction here. Moreover, I'll just point out, none of this is Catholic ecclesiology. None of this is consistent with Vatican I, as I've shown on this channel before. None of this is Vatican I ecclesiology. Because if you look at Pastor Eternus, paragraphs 6 and 7, it rules against this notion that you could just have this Pope who's at war with the Catholic Church and is trying to introduce heresy into the Catholic Church. That's the Protestant error, which Vatican I in Pastor Eternus, paragraphs 6 and 7, I think of what, the 3rd chapter? I'll have to go back and look at it in just a moment. But I think it's 3rd or 4th chapter, paragraph 6 and 7. I'll check here in just a second. It completely rules against this notion that any Pope could be doing this. Does he address that? No.
In the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it kind of, people forgot about it. But now that all these things are happening, people are like, man, like all the stuff in Garabandal seems to be kind of emerging and almost being like fulfilled in this time. And so people are much more interested in these private revelations, these prophecies that may be speaking direct.
Okay, I confirmed it's chapter 4, paragraph 6 and 7 of Pastor Eternus, just to be specific, because there are different paragraphs for each chapter. So I just wanted to make sure I had the right chapter there. I'll put a link to the show notes where I did a review of those paragraphs.
To political events in our time.
Your thoughts on those?
I think it's interesting. Again, since it's not approved, you know, I don't want to be part of an end times cult or, you know, but.
Except he kind of already is. Golly, it's almost comical going through his videos and seeing how many of them are peddling massive conspiracies based on whack interpretations of prophecy. It's kind of comical to look through and see that, and all the fear mongering and fear peddling that takes place promoting some of these prophecies that aren't even approved.
I follow it. I definitely follow it.
Okay.
Did you know?
So let's now go to skip to the 104-minute mark, where he's going to talk about Bishop Strickland and Vigano and so on. Let's go watch that part. Now, I've done multiple videos on both individuals, Strickland and Vigano. I've had Strickland on multiple times, and I've done videos on his situation currently, many of them, as well as, again, Vigano. Let's see what he says right around the 104-minute mark.
Looking at Francis and seeing him and wondering, I mean, my Catholic part of my family does not like Pope Francis. Yeah. They do not like, they don't think he's, you know, on the right side.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like his Mormon family and Taylor Marshall would, you know, get along really well.
How do you respond to that?
I'm one of those people. And you have to be very careful as a Catholic because you recognize office, but you can resist.
Right. So here's the problem. I would actually suggest to you Taylor Marshall actually doesn't recognize the office. It's not that he recognizes the office, he resists. He does not recognize the office because he has redefined what that office's functions are and what it can and cannot do. So according to Taylor Marshall's understanding of the office, he assents. But that's the problem. He redefines what the office of the Pope is. It's kind of like the Eastern Orthodox who could say, I accept the papacy and I accept the Pope. when he's teaching proper Orthodox theology. Okay, well, now you've just redefined what you mean by the papal office. You say you accept the papal office, but you just mean by that something other than what Catholics actually mean by that. So he says, I accept the papal office, but not really, because actually he sits in judgment of the papal office and accuses it of teaching heresy.
You know, and, you know, I was just near us in Tyler, Texas, is Bishop Strickland. I don't know if you follow that story.
I want you to talk about this.
So I actually met with him yesterday, and he is under investigation and will likely be asked to resign or be removed. And he's the one Catholic bishop in America who was outspoken against enforced mandates for receiving a certain injection, you know, during a time. And when the LA Dodgers had these transvestites dressed up like nuns, he was the only bishop who went out there and he peacefully prayed and just stood as a witness that, you know, men dressing up as transsexual nuns with crosses and rosary.
You know, the bishop at that time was having a massive reparation in his cathedral, and there were other bishops who spoke up against this as well.
Is blasphemous, and it should not be promoted by the Dodgers. And he's one of the few bishops in America who's, you know, raised questions about the agenda of Pope Francis.
I love the way these radical traditionalists use these euphemisms. He's questioned. This is exactly what the progressives and radical liberals do. This is exactly what they do on the left. They redefine what a woman is. They redefine what a woman is to now say that a man can become pregnant. Or I'm sorry, a man who identifies as a woman, but really is still a man, can actually be pregnant, right? Because they're redefining what a woman is, redefining what a man is, redefining all those things. I love how the radical traditionalists do the exact same things that the radical progressives do. The radical liberals redefine what is love, redefine what is murder. Well, here we're seeing the same thing. Oh, he's just questioned some things. Oh, that's what we call it, questioning things. Oh, because I was actually under the impression that Bishop Strickland actually said the papacy teaches heresy and signed a document accusing the Pope of teaching heresy. That's a little more than question. You know what? I'm questioning some things of Pope Francis. That makes sense of me. You can say Michael Lofton questions some things from Pope Francis. That's a true statement. Is that an accurate description of what Strickland has done? No. But he's not going to tell you that. He's not going to say that. He's not going to say, no, he's doing more than questioning some things. He's accused the papacy of teaching heresy. You know why he's not going to say anything about that? Because Taylor Marshall does the same thing. Bishop Strickland has accused the papacy, not just Pope Francis as a private individual, the papacy of teaching heresy. I'll show it to you again for those of y'all who may not have seen it. I know I pulled it up many times here on the show. But right here, full statement saying Pope Francis' teaching on Holy Communion already condemned by the Council of Trent. They specifically label it in this article as heresy. In the document, they say, this is the dogma of Trent. Pope Francis teaches in his magisterium, contrary to that in Desiderio Desideravi. Ergo, they're accusing him of teaching heresy in his magisterium. And guess who signs it? Guess who's the first person to sign it? Strickland, Schneider, Altman, who's also now just gone off the hinges and become a set of contests. Some interesting names on here, by the way. Peter Kay. Some really interesting names. People need to go through this. Father Gerald Murray accuses the Pope, the papacy, of teaching heresy. Since when has that been traditional for an individual to privately judge the papacy? Never. That's never been traditional. When Photius did that, he was anathematized and condemned. The Eighth Ecumenical Council condemned him for that, for the things that Marshall is doing, for the things that Bishop Strickland has done, in sitting in judgment of the First See and accusing the papacy of teaching heresy. The Eighth Ecumenical Council, which has an anathema for people who do this, anathematized Photius for doing this. It also spoke about how Dioscorus of Alexandria was also anathematized for judging the first see, for judging Rome, which you don't get to do. The most Catholic thing to do is say the first see is judged by no one. And yet they're judging the magisterium of the first see left and right, even publicly, signing documents accusing it of heresy. Both of them, Strickland and Marshall. But they won't tell you that. They'll just repackage it like the liberals and just say, well, it's not murder, it's just pro-choice. Well, it's not the sin of sodomy, it's just love. They make it sound nice. Oh, he's just questioning some things of the Pope. No, he's judged the first see. Canonically, that is not allowed. And number two, that is not allowed by divine faith from Matthew 16. You don't get to do that. As a bishop, you don't get to do that. You don't get to do that as a theologian or a layman or a YouTuber. None of that. The only one who can judge the first see is a sitting pope. A sitting pope can judge a predecessor pope, a deceased pope, such as in the case of Honorius, Leo II, with his brother bishops, judged a previous pope, Honorius. So even a council alone can't judge a pope. The council itself has to be united to the first see, and the first see, in conjunction with the brother bishops, can judge a previous deceased pope. This is what the Eighth Ecumenical Council teaches us. I did a video on it the other day if you want a longer treatise of that. I went through the Acts and read the Acts and also read through the canons. But what we're doing is we're playing with fire. People were anathematized for what Strickland has done and what Taylor Marshall is doing. So let's stop playing these games. Let's stop just saying, well, this bishop has done some really nice things. Yes, Photius did some really nice things, but he was condemned whenever he accused the first see of teaching heresy. Dioscorus did some nice things, but he was condemned for this stuff. So don't just point to some, well, he did this nice thing. He said this. Yes, but he also then violated something that you can't do in the Catholic Church. But of course, they're not going to talk about that.
And lo and behold, he had an investigation against him ordered by the Vatican.
Yeah, gee, I wonder why. Yeah. Bishop Barron pretty much says the same things that Strickland says. Bishop Barron's not being investigated. Why is that? You know why? Because Bishop Barron hasn't accused the papacy of teaching heresy. That's why.
Half ago. And it was just released over the weekend that a meeting between the Pope and two cardinals, that they were going to ask Bishop Strickland in Tyler, Texas, just an hour and a half from here, to resign. And if he didn't resign, they're going to increase the encouragement for him to resign.
Yeah, which the Pope can and should do for somebody who is judging the first see. My point is, he also just needs to be consistent and start addressing some of the others who are doing the same thing. Not just Strickland, but all of the others who are setting themselves in opposition to the magisterium. Left or right, be consistent. But that doesn't mean that this shouldn't be addressed. It certainly should. But he's going to portray it as, oh, well, he's just being persecuted because he's conservative. No. Then why isn't Bishop Barron being investigated? He's not. Because Bishop Barron has not set himself in opposition to the papacy, which Strickland has done multiple times.
What did he do?
He's a witness to the truth. I mean,
excuse me, that is what the Pope is. Read Vatican I again. Again, Pastor Eternus, chapter 4, paragraph 6 and 7. That is the office of the papacy ultimately. Yes, every bishop in his local diocese is a witness to the truth, but the witness to the truth universally is the Pope. But Marshall doesn't actually believe that because he doesn't embrace Vatican I ecclesiology at the heart of it. Because he holds to a Protestant error, a Protestant ecclesiology. He doesn't actually believe that the Pope is safeguarding the truth. He doesn't believe Pastor Eternus. He doesn't believe chapter 4, paragraph 6 and 7. He does not believe that. He believes the Pope is at war against the truth. And so he now has to point to other bishops that set themselves in opposition to the papacy and say, that's a hero. He's standing for the truth and he's being persecuted for the truth. He had asked him right now, point blank, why is this happening? Did he say, well, he judged the first see and he does it over and over and over? Did he say that? No. He says, oh, well, he's being persecuted for witnessing to the truth. Excuse me, that's what the papacy does. But you don't believe that the current pontificate does that. Because number one, you either don't believe that the person who actually sits in the chair of St. Peter actually sits in the chair of St. Peter, i.e. you don't believe that Pope Francis is actually the Pope, or you just don't believe Vatican I ecclesiology, one of the two. Well, so far he claims that he believes Pope Francis is the Pope. At least, well, he's put that into question many, many times, but he calls him Pope Francis. So I'm going to have to believe that he just doesn't believe Vatican I ecclesiology.
No, but what?
Like, what is his crime?
What's his crime?
No one knows. No one knows.
Actually, they've told you what the issue is. A lot of the concerns were in how he has managed his diocese. Whether you agree or not, that is the answer that has been given. Also, his opposition to the Holy See. That's also been a concern. But instead of presenting the truth to Glenn Beck and the viewers, instead of giving them all of the information, he tries to portray Strickland as a martyr. And watch what he says next.
That's the problem. His crime is that he is a very bold witness. And somebody feels very threatened by this and is tattletelling to Rome and saying, get this guy out of here. You should have him on the show. He's just down the
I
street.
would love to.
Yeah.
I'd love to. You put me in touch with him.
I'd be happy to.
The times are calling for extraordinary bravery.
Yeah. And he is. I mean, and you meet Bishop Strickland and all.
It is not brave to oppose the Holy See. It's in fashion. It's in vogue. The enemies of the church are doing it. Glenn Beck, a Mormon, is doing that. Everyone's doing it. The world does it. And a ton of radical traditionalists in the Catholic Church are doing it. It's in vogue. It's the fashion. There's no courage here. There's no courage needed to oppose the Holy See. That's what everyone is being encouraged to do. What actually takes courage is to defend the truth and defend the papal claims and defend the papal magisterium when you're going to get slandered every single day. You're going to get lied about every single day. You're going to be labeled a popesplainer. You're going to get people who threaten you and your family. You're going to get all kinds of things. That takes more courage than just sitting back on social media and on YouTube railing against the papacy or on Twitter.
All he talks about is Jesus Christ. And I'm not like exaggerating.
Yeah.
Like, he's a person who's on fire for the Lord, and he wants people to know, love, and serve God.
Yeah, I found that interesting. He says, look, this is a guy, Bishop Strickland. All he does is talk about Jesus Christ. Wonderful for him. Great. You know who else? All he ever did was talk about Jesus Christ. You know who else did that? Martin Luther. Martin Luther talked about Jesus all the time, constantly. So much so, he actually believed the book of James maybe shouldn't be part of the canon because it doesn't talk about Jesus enough. It's not Jesus-centered enough. That's what Luther believed. He's so focused on talking about Jesus, which is a great thing in and of itself. But we're talking about a man really, really concentrated on talking about Jesus to that point. And yet, he also condemned the papacy and accused it of teaching heresy. So don't point to, well, he's a good guy. Well, he talks about Jesus a lot. Wonderful. I can point you to all kinds of people who are problematic in church history who did the exact same thing. But it doesn't take away from the fact that they also judge the first see, and therefore they're the losers in church history. The people who do what Strickland has done, are always the losers in church history. They're the ones who set themselves in opposition to the Holy See. They judge the first see. And then every single time in church history, we look back on them and say they were either a heretic or a schismatic or both. They're always the losers in church history. Everybody who sets themselves in opposition to the Holy See are the losers in church history. You might not see that now. 50 years from now, they're going to look back on this and say the same about people today who are doing this to the current pontificate.
And he's talking about the gospel, and he's just a witness. He's a joyful man who you can tell Christ is alive in him. He's a bishop of the Catholic Church, and he's being a witness against things that are very controversial, like transsexualism and imposed medical treatments.
I think
Yeah, Bishop Barron does that too. He's not being investigated. I wonder why. Because it's not about those issues. That's not why he's being investigated. That's why. So this is disingenuous to not tell the audience what really is causing this investigation.
Jesus probably would be very clear too.
Yes, and for that fact, he's being persecuted.
So,
Well, Marshall isn't being very clear here, so that's not very Jesus-like.
so one last thing. Isn't there another, is he a cardinal up in Philadelphia that is very outspoken, that's always in trouble with the Vatican? Someplace back east, I thought.
Well, there's Father James Altman, who's been in trouble a lot. There's Archbishop Vigano.
Yeah,
Altman, who's a sedevacantist and doesn't believe Pope Francis is the Pope. Yeah, that Altman.
that's who I was
Okay,
thinking,
Archbishop Vigano.
Vigano, who doesn't believe Pope Francis is the Pope and is also a sedevacantist. Yeah, that Vigano.
He's actually Italian, and he used to be the ambassador from the Vatican to the United States. So he lived in D.C., and he was the go-between between the Pope and the President and everyone, right?
Well, I love him.
He's incredible.
That's so funny that they love Vigano, who says the most psychotic things if you actually read his letters. And I mean that seriously. I'm not exaggerating. It's insane. Wild stuff. And it's already been shown many of the accusations he made in his original letter against Pope Francis were false. They were false accusations. That's already been substantiated. So he has zero credibility from day one coming out against Pope Francis all the way into the present, where he's just spiraled out of control to the point he no longer believes Pope Francis is the Pope, as I've shown multiple times on this video. And they don't even bat an eye. Now, I don't really expect the Mormon here to really care about somebody denying that Pope Francis is the Pope. I kind of expect him to be on Team Vigano, even though, again, what Vigano says is absolutely psychotic. I kind of expect him to be somewhat opposed to the papacy. But for Taylor Marshall, who claims to hold to the papal office, here you have him Goo gaga over Vigano for years now, who's a sedevacantist, doesn't even believe Francis is the Pope, doesn't believe Vatican I ecclesiology, literally produces the false claim that Rome will become the seat of the Antichrist. Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. I did a show on that 2 days ago showing that's actually not part of Our Lady of La Salette. That was added later on. It was never approved. It was actually on the index of forbidden books. And it's actually a Protestant error. If you look it up in Bellarmine, Bellarmine shows you in his work on the papacy, that's a Protestant error that Protestants use against the Catholic Church, being used by guys like Vigano. And they're praising this guy. That's so weird, right? If I came out and everything I do is praising Anton LaVey, you know, the founder of the Satanists, if I'm just always praising him and always speaking so well of him, you're going to have to start to question me. At least you should. I think we need to be doing that here.
He's incredible.
Yeah, he's incredible. And he asked me to read a prayer and address for him on the Supreme Court during one of the big rallies in the last election. That's another time period. But he is very critical of the agenda of Pope Francis. And he also was the whistleblower on
the agenda of the papacy. Get it straight. It's not just Pope Francis. It's his papacy that he's critical of. He's not just critical of Pope Francis as a private individual. I am too. Join the club. He's critical of the papacy, the official acts of the Holy See.
Cardinal McCarrick, who had been the Cardinal Archbishop of D.C., who molested boys, embezzled.
Yeah, the claims of Vigano here. Again, many of the claims that he made were unsubstantiated. That's the problem. People are like, yeah, Vigano's gone off the rails. He's pretty wild. But his first letter was great. Actually, his first letter, a lot of the information in there turned out to be false. So you can't even give that endorsement of even the first letter anymore.
Money, had done so many horrible things for decades, and people covered and covered and covered for him. Archbishop Vigano, who also had been in D.C. and figured some of these things out and blew the whistle on him. And so Archbishop Vigano is another one of these very loud voices in the Catholic Church, who is also traditionally minded. And
no, he's not. This is not traditional Catholicism. It is not traditional to be a set of contest. It is not traditional to accuse the Pope Francis or any pope of being a heretic and judging the first see. Only a pope can judge a predecessor pope. It is not traditional for any bishop or anybody to set themselves in opposition to the papacy. It is not traditional. That is not the Catholic faith. This is Catholicism 101. We should know this already. That's not traditional. It is not traditional to say Rome will lose the faith and become the seat of the Antichrist. News flash. That's Protestantism. That literally comes from the Protestant reformers. That's not Catholicism. And yet all of these things are the things that Vigano is saying and things that Taylor Marshall praises. This is not traditional.
he's living in hiding right now.
In hiding?
Yes, he's living in hiding.
Why?
Because he's an old man and he's afraid they're going to get him.
Who's going to get him?
Important people. I mean, it was just...
Wow. Wow.
It's announced today that Francis is having this meeting with Bill Clinton and Gavin Newsom.
And Gavin Newsom?
Yes.
Wow, that's double the...
And, you know, the Clintons, you bring in the Clintons and things get a little, you know, sometimes you want to go into hiding.
So it sounds to me like he's suggesting Pope Francis will use the Clintons to off his opposition and to murder his opposition. Did you hear that? It sounds like he's suggesting Pope Francis, you know, Vigano has to be in hiding because Pope Francis is going to murder him. Listen to that again.
And people covered and covered and covered for him. Archbishop Vigano, who also had been in D.C. and figured some of these things out and blew the whistle on him. And so Archbishop Vigano is another one of these very loud voices in the Catholic Church, who is also traditionally minded, and he's living in hiding right now.
In hiding?
Yes, he's living in hiding.
Why?
Because he's an old man and he's afraid they're going to get him.
Okay, they're going to get him. Who's they? Who's the they who's going to murder him?
Who's going to get him?
Important people. I mean,
okay, who's the important people? What does he shift to?
I mean, it was just announced today that Francis is having this meeting with Bill Clinton and...
Okay, so now who is it who's going to off Vigano? Well, it was just announced today that Francis is meeting with Bill Clinton. Follow the conversation here. Let's see where this train of thought goes.
Gavin Newsom.
And Gavin Newsom?
Yes.
Wow, that's double the...
And, you know, the Clintons, you bring in the Clintons and things get a little, you know, sometimes you want to go into hiding.
So you bring in the Clintons and you need to go into hiding because they're going to murder somebody, is what he's saying. Okay, so let's follow the progress of that one more time. Where's Vigano now? He's in hiding. Why is he in hiding? He's afraid he's going to be murdered. By who? Well, it's just so happens that Pope Francis just met with Bill Clinton. And if we know, if you're with the Clintons, you know, if the Clintons are after you, you better go in hiding because your life's in jeopardy. So what are you saying? You're saying that Pope Francis effectively is threatening Vigano's life. That's what you're saying, even though you don't say those words. That's what you're inevitably saying. That's the conclusion to what you're saying and what you're suggesting to everybody. Let's just be clear here, because he's not being clear. They're talking about Jesus and praise Jesus for being clear, except he's not. He's not being clear like Jesus. Be clear. You're suggesting that Pope Francis has these connections with Bill Clinton so he can murder his opposition. Just be very clear about that. Make sure you're upfront with people and very clear about the accusations that you're making against the Pope.
It's
crazy, right?
It's crazy.
It's absolutely crazy.
I agree. It is crazy. And both of these guys are crazy.
We're living in like a Jason Bourne movie.
I know.
It's weird.
It is.
It is really weird.
Yeah.
The amount of propaganda and deception that has to take place, the amount of conditioning from propaganda to arrive at this point, I imagine it's decades of propaganda and conditioning to reach this level right here that you just witnessed. That a quote unquote Catholic could say such things. I kind of expect it from the Mormon, not from the quote unquote Catholic. Wow. Let me say this. I golly, I don't know what to say. Let me maybe just read this quote to you from Newman. I think maybe this is insightful. This is from his Grammar of Assent. Somebody actually posted it earlier today, and I appreciated that they posted it because I actually thought it was very fitting for what we're saying right now. Let me read this quote to you, and I'll tie it into this conversation. Newman said, "A man is converted to the Catholic Church from his administration of its religious system and its disgust or his disgust with Protestantism." So a man came to the Catholic Church because he's disgusted with Protestantism and he loves the religious system he finds in Catholicism. That admiration remains, but only after a time. But after a time, he leaves his new faith, perhaps returns to his old. The reason, if we may conjecture, may sometimes be this: he has never believed in the church's infallibility. In her doctrinal truth, he has believed, but in her infallibility, no. He's saying this person converts to the Catholic Church. They hate the problems they see in Protestantism, and they're attracted to the beauty of Catholicism. But they never really embrace the Catholic magisterium and its teaching authority and its power to bind their conscience and their duty to submit to it. They don't really embrace that. Rather, they agree with the magisterium and the Catholic Church insofar as it agrees with their views. He continues, in her doctrinal truth he has believed, but in her infallibility, no. He was asked before he was received whether he held all that the church taught. He replied he did, but he understood the question to mean whether he held those particular doctrines, which at that time the church in matter of fact formally taught, whereas it really meant whatever the church then or at any future time should teach. In other words, some people are coming into the Catholic Church and they say, yes, I believe everything the church teaches, only up until this time. But if the church later on says something I don't agree with, no, I'm not going to agree with that. And I'm going to oppose it. I might even condemn. I might even anathematize the papacy. I might even accuse it of heresy or this council of heresy. I agree with the magisterium insofar as it agrees with me. And I agree with it up until this time. But later on, if it actually says something I don't agree with, my conscience is not going to be captive to the magisterium. No, it's going to be the other way around. My conscience is going to allow me to judge the magisterium. Thus, he never had the indispensable and elementary faith of a Catholic and was simply no subject for reception into the fold of the church. This being the case, when the Immaculate Conception is defined, he feels that it is something more than he bargained for when he became a Catholic, and accordingly, he gives up his religious profession. At the time, that was newly defined. And some Catholics said, oh, well, I don't agree with this Immaculate Conception. And rather than assenting to the magisterium that teaches it, they say, no, I get to judge the magisterium. I don't agree. Now, there's some parallels today. When the church clarifies its position on this or that teaching, oh, no, I don't agree with it. I don't agree with that. I'm going to sit in opposition to the magisterium. I'm going to oppose it. I don't agree with it. He continues, the world will say that he has lost his certitude of the divinity of the Catholic faith. But really, he never had it. That's from an essay, An Aid to a Grammar of Assent, page 133. And so the point is, What you're seeing with Catholics, many Catholics today, falling left and right, what you're seeing being exposed is they didn't actually embrace the Catholic faith to begin with. They didn't actually embrace the magisterium and its teaching authority and ability to bind their conscience. They didn't. They only accepted the magisterium insofar as it agreed with their views, their existing views. But as soon as the magisterium clarifies itself on a matter of faith and morals, and it's something they don't agree with, rather than saying, okay, I'm going to conform and assent to that, and I'm going to offer religious submission of intellect and will to what the church teaches and correct my misunderstanding. No, I'm going to sit in judgment, death penalty, sit in judgment of this and that, and no more Satitia, sit in judgment of this and that, and desiderio desideravi. I'm going to sit in judgment of these things. And rather than allow the magisterium to interpret the faith and show me what I am to assent to, I am going to sit in judgment of the magisterium. That is a person who never really accepted the magisterium to begin with. They only accepted themselves. And that's ultimately what Luther was doing. And that was his problem. And that's how Protestantism started. And so what's happening is the current situation in the church, in the actual magisterium, what the magisterium actually teaches, it's exposing a lot of rot that was already there and a lot of faithlessness. It's exposing people who didn't really belong to us to begin with. They were of us, but they didn't really belong to us, as 1 John says. Right? That's what we're seeing at this point. It's uncovering all of this rot. And so I challenge anybody who is listening to these radical traditionalists, thinking that they're hearing the Catholic faith and the traditional faith, I challenge you to reconsider that. That's not true. Much of what you're hearing is not traditional. This is not traditional Catholicism. And what I have for you is I have an entire playlist filled with free videos for you. Years of videos of research based on research that I've done, going over what the magisterium teaches, just simply showing you what the magisterium teaches. Years of research that I've done that will help you work through some of this confusion. It's called Recovering from Radical Traditionalism, right? Appropriately called. Recovering from Radical Traditionalism. If you want the traditional Catholic faith, you go to what the magisterium teaches. Not what people are saying in opposition to the pontificate of the current pontificate or the papacy or the most recent ecumenical council, the magisterium. You go to what the magisterium teaches, not those who are setting themselves in opposition to the magisterium. That's traditional Catholicism. Highly recommend you check out that playlist. Again, it's free. I also have a free ebook for you, Church Chaos, where it goes over a lot of the confusion in the crisis in the Catholic Church. I recognize that there is a crisis. I talk about it, but then I give you biblical precedent for these same problems in the history of God's people. And I show you, here's how God's covenant people addressed it in the past. And here's how we should be addressing it now in a healthy way without going too far and becoming schismatic. Again, it's free. Go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see a pop-up come up, Church Chaos. Just simply click on it, put in your email, and you'll get the PDF for free right then and there. So check that out. And again, my Recovering from Radical Traditionalism playlist right here on YouTube. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, if you found it beneficial, I need you to do your part by hitting the like button, comment, and subscribe. When you do those things, YouTube sees your response to this video, and it will share it with other people. So if you want more people to see this, so that we can shout the truth louder than the liars are shouting the lies, I need you to do your part. Help me grow this channel so that I can reach more people with this information, to help clear up some of this confusion. So please do that. Also, if you want to support what I'm doing here at Reason and Theology, because this is how I provide for my family, if you believe what I'm doing is good work, check me out at patreon.com/Reason and Theology. You get access to extra content, extra benefits, and you're supporting what I'm doing. I'll also put a GoFundMe in the show notes, as well as a PayPal if you would just rather use those instead of Patreon. So certainly check those out. All right. Thank y'all so much for watching. Again, share this with your friends on social media and hit that subscribe button. All right. We'll see you later. God bless. Are you confused about how Catholic teaching authority works? With encyclicals, papal bulls, councils, and many other things, it's easy to get confused on what is authoritative and what is not. Fortunately, at maximusinstitute.com, I have prepared a course explaining the magisterium from A to Z. Visit the website and check out the course Understanding the Magisterium for more information. If you're looking to buy or sell a home, office, or any kind of property anywhere in the world, you're going to want to call Real Estate for Life, and they're going to connect you with a Catholic agent. Now, that agent will donate a portion of their commission upon sale, and Real Estate for Life will donate 75% of that gift to a pro-life organization at no cost to you. Call Real Estate for Life at 1-877-LIFE-US1 or text them 248-431-1440. If you care about the pro-life cause, call them now. Hey everybody, just wanted to tell you about my new free ebook, Church Chaos, Biblical Insights for Confused Catholics. If you are a confused Catholic and you're thinking about leaving the Catholic Church, or you're thinking about converting to the church, but you see that there's a crisis in the church and you're just unsure, this is the book for you. Again, it is free. Just simply go to reasonandtheology.com. You'll see a pop-up that comes up on your screen. Just simply click on it and you'll put in your email and it will provide you the free PDF ebook right then and there. Please check it out if you're confused about the situation in the Catholic Church today. Reason and Theology.
Is it possible that ancient aliens created other ancient aliens? Ancient alien theorists say yes. But then, is it also possible that ancient aliens created the ancient alien theorists? And are the ancient aliens and ancient alien theorists led by the Vatican, headed by the Pope? Ancient alien theorists and certain unnamed Catholic YouTubers say yes.
Tired of Catholic shows that peddle conspiracy theories that sound like something out of an Ancient Aliens episode? Check out Reason and Theology for a more reasonable take.